On Facebook, there was a request to show how to do mitered corners, and this video is to show how to do mitered corners in the binding. There's more than one way to bind a quilt, and there's more than one way to get a mitered corner. This corner is not mitered. This was how books showed to finish corners when I first started quilting many years ago. It's just run to the end, then the next piece is overlapped and it's turned under, and a neat finish, but it's not a mitered corner. This quilt is a mitered corner. With this method, you have one long piece and you fold the miters into the corner. And the only drawback with that one is somewhere you need to join your binding strips. And I personally don't enjoy doing that. Looking for my binding, here it is. This, you may not be able to see it too well, but right here is an angled seam where that binding was joined once it was all done. Now, this corner is mitered, and the miters are sewn in the binding process. So it's finished on both sides, it's sewn shut, and my binding is joined here. So I don't have to figure out how much to leave in tail somewhere else and join it. So I'm going to show you that process. And I have a quilt ready to go, so we're going to use that. My quilt is all quilted and I'm ready to bind, and you may notice that I haven't trimmed down my quilt. You can trim it down. Just leave enough of the batting and backing that you fill your binding all the way to the edge. Here is an example of a binding from many years ago that is not filled to the edge. It's flat here and it's been trimmed off right here. You don't want that look. You want it filled. So, if you trim, you could leave like 1/4 of an inch and then trim down anything more you wanted after that. And trimming is a good time to square up your corners. Mine are not too bad. You can also just draw a line if you want to keep it in square. I have already made my binding. I cut 2.5-inch strips, pieced them together, and then press them in half lengthwise. You do not have to have 2.5-inch strips. If you want a little bit narrower binding, you can do 2.25-inch strips. I am going to sew the binding on with a 1/4-inch seam. Doesn't matter what size seam you use, you just have to know what size you're going to use, because whatever the size of your seam, you're going to start and stop that same distance from the corner. So because I'm using a 1/4-inch seam, I'm going to start my stitching 1/4 of an inch in. If I was going that way, I do back tack, but I make sure that those stitches do not go any further than 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the quilt. Now, you can mark this if you want to. What I usually do is put a pin right where the quilt runs up to the edge, and then I use my 1/4-inch foot. Now, 1/4-inch feet will vary depending on brands. This is one for one of my sewing machines. This mark is where the needle lines up with the hole, and this mark right here is a 1/4-inch back from the needle. This mark is a 1/4-inch in front of the needle. So when I'm ready to start sewing, put my binding piece on, and I leave a flap hanging over the end because this is where I'm going to put my miters in. It doesn't have to be a huge amount, an inch, 2 inches. I probably usually do about 2. So when I start sewing, if this was at the sewing machine, I would put it down and I would line that pin up with that mark that's 1/4 of an inch behind where the needle is. And you can see it's here on top too. And then I would start sewing, and this is backwards from what the sewing machine would be, but I start sewing, I do a couple back tack stitches, and then keep going all the way to the other end. Now when I get to the other end, I have marked the edge of the quilt there as well. And so when I'm coming up to the end, say I've been stitching here, that mark on the 1/4 inch foot that is in front of the needle is where I want to stop with that lined up with the pin. And again, I do a back tack and finish off. So that is one side. We're going to put all 4 sides on the same way. Let me show you with one side already attached. Okay, I've sewn this strip on, and here is where I've stopped, a 1/4 inch from the edge. If I flip it back, you'll see I have a 1/4 inch here. So when I get ready to sew the next piece on, I still put a pin in here so that I can see the edge, so I can line it up with my foot. I need to fold this strip back out of the way, and you can pin it if you need to, if it doesn't want to stay out of the way. Then I want to overlap that flap with my next extra hanging out here. And again, with my 1/4 inch foot, I'm going to start with that mark that is behind the needle hole. And I will start stitching there, a couple stitches forward, couple stitches back, and then continue on to the other end. Okay, so now I'm coming up on the end of this side. Here's my presser foot coming up. This is a strip I have already sewn on. Again, I need to fold it out of the way, and I want to pin in on the edge of the quilt so I know where I want to stop a 1/4 inch from that place. And again, I want to fold that out of the way. I let this, if it's extra long, doesn't matter, we'll cut it off later. And I sew right up to the edge, and when I see that my mark that's a 1/4 inch in front of the needle lines up with that pin, that's where I want to stop and do my back tacking. So I'm going to go ahead and sew all 4 edges on here, and then I will show you what it should look like when you open it up and how to miter those corners. So this is my corner. I have both pieces coming up to the edge. See, they're overlapping. My goal when I open these up is that my stitching meets right here. This one stops and this one starts. So once I've checked that and I'm happy with it, I want to fold, the quilt back out of the way. And I'm going to pin my 2 extending flaps together. And I usually put a couple of pins in. Okay? So I have my pins in. If you want to use just a regular ruler to mark your miter, you can do that. So what I want to find, if I'm using the regular ruler, is I want to measure from right here where my stitching line to my fold line. And in this case, it's rough. It's pretty close to 1 inch. I want to take half that measurement, so 1/2 inch, and I mark a vertical line here. It's going up and away into my overhang. And if it helps you, you can also mark a line. You want to go right where the stitches end here out to the fold line. So like that. Okay, these are just guidelines. You don't have to have them, but they can help you keep everything straightened out. Now, I sat down and figured this out years ago, and a few weeks later, I was watching Simply Quilts, and there was Jackie Robinson on TV talking about the same process, but she had a specialty ruler. For the 90-degree corners, just your square ruler will work just fine. So to mark my angle, my 90-degree angle, and I think it looks like the roof on top of a house, I want to line up, and I can use my center line on that line that I marked right here. I want to make sure that I'm coming in right where the stitches stop, and then I mark a line or a corner from there to there. And you want to make sure that's straight. And I'm kind of at a funny angle because of the camera, but Now when I go to stitch this, I want to do a back, I usually start in here at the seam line. So I will take a couple stitches, back stitch, and then go. When I come up to the point, I stop just short of the point and take one stitch straight across the point. And then I pivot and come down, and again back stitch, and then clip my threads. Now the reason for that single stitch across the point is you actually get a sharper point when you're turning it than if you had come all the way to the point and then pivoted. It gives space for the seam allowance to be turned in. That's a technique that's used in clothing construction and collar points. So I'm going to stitch my corners and then come back and show you. I mentioned that Jackie Robinson had a ruler when I was watching her on TV, and this is what it looks like. It can do 4 different angles, so it's a nice to have if you like this method. If you're using her ruler, you don't need to mark your vertical line like I showed you. You just kind of center it. You can do it visually. I check to see if I have about the same amount out here and mark my 90-degree angle. And now I really am going to go stitch. I have my point stitched, and you may have a hard time seeing it on camera. Before I start cutting off my excess, I like to still come in and check and make sure everything looks like what I think I want, what I want it to look like. And after I've done that, then I cut straight across, just leave a little bit above the point. And here and here to take the bulk out. So I have my point. And now I'm ready to turn it. At this point, a point turner is a really good idea. I will admit that I have used scissors before. If you choose to do that, be very, very careful, because if you get too exuberant, you'll put a hole right through the end of your miter. I like to open it up as much as I can, the seams, both ways, and sort of finger press, turn it, and then once you get the point turner in there, you'll get that nice sharp point. At this point, I need to trim away my batting, and while that's not part of mitering, this is what I do. It's not an exact science, it's just what I choose to do. Other people will tell you other things. If you're doing a show quilt, you probably really should have squared it all up before you put the binding on so that everything's perfectly straight. I push my binding out and fold it back on itself, and that's where I want my batting to fill to, all the way out to that edge. So I can measure with the ruler, and in this case it's just a hair less than ½ an inch. And it depends on how thick your batting is, but when I go to trim, then I like to line up my line with my seam rather than the edge and trim away. And if this is a little tiny bit wider than what our measurement was here, that's okay. It will just fill it in more. You don't want a lot because you don't want it to look bulky. So let me trim down the quilt, and I'll come back and show you how, when you get ready to stitch on the back side, your points are already turned perfectly. I have my quilt all trimmed down now. I find that before I turn the corners, it is helpful to cut a diagonal off of the backing and batting, like that. So it's just a little bit, there's already a lot of bulk going into that corner. Then turn it. Have the corner turned, and these are Wonder clips on here. They're great for holding this while you're hand stitching. This is the front side. If you flip it over, I haven't started stitching yet, but the back side, notice it comes up perfectly when you're ready to stitch, so you just go around that corner. So all that's left on here now is my hand stitching, and I have pretty nice looking corners on my binding.